As we begin the 2024 hurricane season, the National Hurricane Center has predicted a higher than average year for named storms, somewhere between 17 and 25. Planning is always key to a successful response to any disaster, and there are pretty good odds that a named storm will hit the U.S. coastline this year. So today we talk to an expert in disaster response planning. I'm Kevin Peterson. Welcome to Weather Heroes. A key partner in the planning process, as well as the response process, is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Today we talk with the FEMA Hurricane Program Director, Brandon Bolinski. As a program director, Brandon works with officials at all levels, city, county, state, federal, and private industry, bringing them together for planning purposes as well as helping coordinate response efforts. He's well qualified for his role, having a meteorology degree, having worked in emergency planning at the state level, and also at the National Weather Service before joining FEMA in 2005. Brandon shares a lot of valuable information and insights, as well as his time. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. Well, today we speak with Brandon Bolinski. He is the FEMA Hurricane Program Manager. Welcome, Brandon.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. I appreciate it and happy to be here.
Oh, thank you for joining us today. So tell me a little bit about your personal background that led you to FEMA.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting one. I do have a degree in meteorology. I don't currently practice much of it. The funny thing is you'd speak probably with meteorologists, a lot of them have a origin story. Oh, I remember when I was a kid, there was a tornado and that got me, or there was a hurricane and that got me. So for years, I never knew what mine was. Believe it or not, no joke. I always joke that I kind of fell into meteorology and weather on accident. I always liked the hard sciences. Knew I was going to Florida State University, and somehow I picked up the course, like curriculum or the book that had all the good stuff in it, and saw meteorology. Like, I'm going to do that. No idea why, but did it. But it wasn't until recently I was doing some research a little bit for a class I was doing, and I was going through some old photos, and I forgot that one of my first hurricanes was Hurricane David in 1979. And I had pictures. I have memories of that storm. I was very young, but it was those core memories that got me interested in meteorology and hurricanes. And so maybe there was something deep down in my brain that kind of led me this way, and I didn't know it until recently. But went to Florida State University, and when I graduated, was trying to find anything. Weather service I was interning at. I was working for the university in the meteorology department for a little something, and I was interning at the state of Florida emergency management office. That was when there was a lot of drought and fires and El Niños and hurricanes, and I got picked up there and worked there for a few years as kind of a meteorologist, planner, just kind of jack of all trades. And it's funny that a lot of meteorologists started finding their way into emergency management in the late 90s, early 2000s because of all the weather. So I started there, made my way to National Weather Service and forecasting, love that. And then in 2005 to FEMA in the hurricane program. It kind of took a while, but been there ever since.
Yeah, I remember those years. Everything was blamed on El Nino. As I look at your background, you talked about working with the state of Florida as well. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 2022, you received a Distinguished Service Award at the National Hurricane Conference. And you received that as part of your role in FEMA, working with federal, state, and local partners. And it looks like your background really sets you up very well for that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kevin. Yeah, it's funny how I think I've always enjoyed helping folks and being part of that. And whether it was with the state of Florida or in the weather service, you get to interact with so many different types of people and needs, whether it be the public or partner agencies. And I keep getting to do that with my role now. And that's one of when people ask me about my job, the best part is working with all those folks that you see and hear from during a hurricane, whether it be the Hurricane Center, the media, or other support offices in the National Weather Service. Yeah, just that unique background between the state emergency management and National Weather Service of kind of still mixing all those contacts and those people that I've been working with for 20 some years. It's crazy when you go back, like, holy cow. Remember when we met when I first started and we're still working together? I had a professor who was doing work with the program. I'm like, I took your class when I was a young kid. So,
That's
no,
great. That is so good.
yeah, it's pretty cool.
As we talk about how you work with everyone and some of your role, if you could explain the basic structure and role of FEMA, because a lot of people don't really know how FEMA works. And then maybe as you talk about that, explain how your role works more so.
A lot of people when they hear FEMA, they might not know what it actually stands for. That what that acronym stands for, the
Oh,
Federal Emergency Management Agency.
good call. Good call.
And once you
Yeah.
figure that out, and then you really break it down, like basically we're a federal organization that deals with emergencies,
Mm-hmm.
and we help manage them. We don't have a lot of stuff. We're not a big agency, but we help manage all those responding agencies and those agencies that have stuff and people and resources and things. So we help manage it, and that's part of the whole emergency management concept. That these are the folks that know where to get things and who to send things and how to prioritize things to help respond to disasters and emergencies. So FEMA, some of the big buckets that people will probably need to know about or would be interested to know about is we do obviously do a lot of response. That's, when you see people on the ground and things like that, we're helping manage a lot of that. We also do recovery after a storm, after a disaster. There's people in the field for years after, making sure and trying to get people whole, trying to make sure the communities are building back whole and taking care of infrastructure and businesses and things like that. Then we also have on the front end, the mitigation side and the preparedness side. We have a whole preparedness side of trying to do outreach and getting communities ready and understanding what they're doing, and mitigation, doing something about it, making physical changes to make disasters less impactful. So those are the big buckets that we work in FEMA and in general emergency management. My role is more on the response side, in that preparedness planning, being ready for, and then dealing with. And it's very focused on hurricanes. Other weather comes into play, but that's the big one. Emergencies that it's coming. It could be very, very bad, multiple states, multiple days. So a lot of my role is making sure that my state partners that have to respond and do all these things at the state level or have the latest and greatest tools for them to make decisions, whether it be a software or information or training to be ready for whatever it takes, whether it be the planning side or the operation side. I know we're going to talk a little bit about what is preparedness, what is planning, and that whole thing. And I think that's really interesting thought when you break down. Planning side has always been more of an art than science. When you talk about planning for emergencies or planning for disasters, how do you plan for something that doesn't happen very often? Something that's hard to, these concepts of, your community, your beach, your home is no longer as you remember it. How do you plan for that? So we do have practitioners that are planning. There's a process, a 6-step planning process they go through.
Can you elaborate?
So the 6-step planning process, kind of a tried and true way to get through a plan. It's important because a lot of what the hurricane evacuation studies do insert into the step 2. And the first step is actually getting the right team, forming a collaborative planning team, getting the right people and the right players to buy off and have input into the plan. That's step 1. Step 2 is understanding the situation. What are we dealing with? What is the threat? What is the hazards? What are the impacts? Hurricanes, tornadoes, insert your hazard there. Then you got to determine, step 3, determine your goals and objectives. What do you want to do with this plan? What are those things you need to get out of it to operate or be ready for? Step 4 is actually develop the plan, getting down and writing, getting those things on paper, annotated what the plan is going to be. And then step 5 is actually getting it all together, getting it reviewed, adjudicated, and approved by the people who are going to be doing plan. And step 6 is implementing it. This is the plan. This is how we're going to operate, socializing it, maintaining it, exercising it. Those next steps, that's your step 6.
The plans are really important. It brings those people together and make them think about what do we do? What do we bring? How do we prioritize? Where do we need help? And a lot of it on the federal side, we're supporting our state partners. They're supporting a local or a county partner. So it's trying to backfill all those needs as these disasters rise to a federal level. So that's the planning side. Preparedness is then, once you have those plans in hand, what do we need to be ready? Making sure our workforce is ready, making sure they understand what resources they have together. And that's when I'm talking preparedness more on the responder side. There's also the preparedness of a citizen or a community or a business and being prepared for a disaster and knowing what they need to do and be ready for a disaster. So that is a whole another art and science too.
Couldn't agree more with that, especially when you're talking about the different types of planning. And, I know when you are training folks or talking to folks at different levels, you're talking really to the county, but there's so many pieces that they're bringing into this: small businesses, the sewer folks, the garbage folks. I mean, you name it, they're involving everybody.
Yeah, right. That's a good part, is that it takes a community across the board, whether it be the private sector, the other local agencies, state agencies, county agencies, because of multi-jurisdictional issues and all that fun stuff, and the citizen too. You can do all you want, and if the citizens and that's that outreach, that really where the kind of the rubber meets the road, that the locals can do with different community groups for folks to understand what they need to do. It feels like we've been fighting the same battle for years. You hear the same thing, as when you deal with hurricanes over and over again, like in Florida, people evacuate that shouldn't evacuate, inland folks that are in good housing, or folks that are on the coast stay because they think the traffic's going to be bad and they need to leave. So it seems like we're always fighting that battle of people really understanding what they need to do and how vulnerable they are.
Well,
And it's sad. It's sad though. Some people just really don't understand how vulnerable they are in some areas where we're building and living.
Yeah,
It's a hard one. It's a hard one. It's
yeah,
a hard one.
no, it's very hard. In fact, those message points, getting those out there, in addition to the continued growth along the coasts of really all the coastal states, you've also got the new people moving there. And to your point, you're having to remessage that same message each year. And even the folks that have been there for a while, who might become somewhat jaded, you're having to remessage that to them, but maybe in a little different way to make sure they understand.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to do too. When you look at a list of what you need to do, it's hard. And you want to talk to someone who might be on the coast and say, okay, what do you need to take with you if you're not going to come back to your home for a week on end, or it might not be here? Or on the flip side, if they're in an area that doesn't need to evacuate and not a place that's not an evacuation zone, you need to be ready to shelter in place for weeks on end. You need to be ready without power for weeks on end. And it means different things to different people. Someone who might not need power and can live out in the woods, great. Go camping, fine. But if you're someone who might be dependent on power for medicine or for other support needs, or you might have whatever it might, all those personal reasons that people have, you need to be ready for that. It's hard to do sometimes, to think about, what do I need to do if my whole world changes? And that's unfortunately what happens with hurricanes. Your whole world changes. Your communities, those things you're used to, those creature comforts, the power of the water, gone for a few hours, one thing; for a few days, ooh.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, you talk about your origin story. Mine is Hurricane Andrew. That's really what got me involved with this, and watching all the preparations and then looking at the evacuations that the county was doing. Again, going back to your idea of, when to make those decisions, how to make those decisions. And I know you do a lot of training on that. Talk to me really, if you could, about the training that you were involved with for the state and local partners and everyone else, and maybe what the tools are that you train them with.
As we were talking a lot about evacuations and understanding these different communities, that's one of those concepts that we've been working with in the past 30, 40 years. I got to count my decades, right? Of understanding these communities where we're building and growing, like you mentioned, and what could a hurricane do? We know that storm surge and water is the number one killer, the number one hazard that's really going to put a hurting on a community and changing it. So we work with the Hurricane Center, National Hurricane Center, and the modelers to understand what does that risk look like from storm surge, using their models and looking at different levels. What does a lower end storm look like? What does a higher end or a more intense storm look like? What about different directions? We know that a direct landfalling, a storm that's coming directly into the coast, is going to be a big deal for some areas. And we can take that and measure for different communities what that means. And it's not across the board. There's a big talk a few years ago about the Saffir-Simpson scale and removal of storm surge. Basically, it was just taking it where it needed to be and saying, a community like we mentioned, Andrew, Dade County, their storm surge threat is different than just a few counties north in Palm Beach County, which is totally different than counties further north, like up Duval or in Georgia, where we have a totally different coastline that storms can impact. So by knowing those differences, we can start understanding who needs to evacuate for what intensity of storm, what level of storm surge, really. So once you figure that out and you go, okay, we have a lot of people in the way here, how do we tell them they need to leave? These maps are, if you look at these storm surge patterns and maps, very complicated based on the rivers and structure and the way the topography is. So we work with emergency managers to take that storm surge modeling and build evacuation zones. These areas are at most risk. This next area is the secondary or tertiary risk. And we try to make it so it's easy to describe. We can call out specific barrier islands or areas east-west of an intercoastal waterway or a river or a major road. There might be a special road that people know that's an ingress, egress, or whatever. We can call these out and delineate them by these political boundaries, geographic boundaries, other things that people know about, and develop these zones that make sense. And so that we can get those folks that really need to get out, communicate it well, and move them to safer zones. And as that risk increases, unfortunately, more and more people. Once we get that, the big question is, well, how long is it going to take? When do I need to start my call? When do I need to start moving these people? I want folks out before the wind and the rains and the storm surge arrive. So we utilize a whole hurricane evacuation study process with those first few steps to understand where they're going to put people, where they're going to go, look at transportation modeling to understand how long will it take to get these people in their cars, given certain assumptions and different scenarios. And this started back in the 80s. We're still doing it today with a very similar process, but leveraging technology, leveraging a lot of those great tools we have in the GIS community and the transportation community to get a good feel for how long it will take. So a community knows that they need a day or 2 days, 3 days, unfortunately. In some of these areas where we have so many people with a small roadway network, it can take a long time if you really want to give people the time they need to get out that are in those evacuation zones. So that's a long process, multi-year process where we involve the county and the state and the locals and the other agencies and contractors and different federal agencies to get this done. It's complicated.
No, it's very complicated. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, if you think about that and if you think about a storm that kind of follows the coast on up and trying to assess the evacuation needs for each area and as it's approaching. And if you think about the variables, I've heard predicting the weather is harder than maybe rocket science. And now you've got to predict the weather and add all these other factors into an evacuation and then get the folks that are in the mandatory evacuation zones to say, hey, you really got to go and get them to understand that. So that is a very, 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 very tough haul that I think y'all have done a really good job on, and as have most of our state and local partners too.
Yeah, and that's that training is if we can give the communities and those emergency managers that are in charge of making that call, the ones that are going to be up there with their mayors or their governors or their elected officials going, these areas need to evacuate. We provide them training so they understand how that works, how those zones are built, so they have confidence in evacuations, and also not just that, but the weather and the forecast piece. The meteorologists will understand the products that the Hurricane Center puts out there, how to use them, integrate the weather with those studies to develop plans. They go back to the planning process, that planning thing. These studies are key starts to how long is it going to take to get these people out? And for different levels of storm surge or intensity of storm, what do I need to do? For a minor storm or a low storm where you might not see as many impacts, I have one course of action that's going to take me so long to do, to implement, and things to bring on. But if I look at something that's a bigger storm, it's going to need more time and more things to get done. So we help them with that training, understanding those tools that are available to them. And also the program you mentioned, HURVAC, it's taking that Hurricane Center forecast, understanding the timing for the communities through the different tools that the Hurricane Center provides for timing of those hazards. We usually winds as a proxy for storm surge, rain, and everything else. So when do those winds arrive and how long do I have till I have to kick that process off? So we also provide training on that program and operations and maintenance of that. And it's pretty impressed with where that program's come. We are now up over 28,000. We're approaching 30,000 registered users for that program. And it's for government, emergency managers, and responding officials on that side. So that because it has some sensitive information about timing and things and putting that together. So it's really made for those decision makers who are making evacuation decisions or timing decisions for sheltering and other support things.
So what you're saying is the HERVAC tool has kind of the National Hurricane Center data, props, maybe coastal data, river data, a bunch of information, population data maybe that helps these folks make the right decision.
Right, exactly. And it gives them that confidence. I have spent years on a hurricane evacuation study. It told me these certain things. I know the Hurricane Center is my authoritative source. It's putting out a forecast every 6 hours and it's changing. How is that matching up with what I'm planning here? So as the forecast, which happens as forecasts change, it might, as we talked about Andrew, even today, there's some forecasts that can change a little bit, but we're looking at those changes. And this gives the ability for that emergency manager to say, so what? So the forecast is more intense. Do I need more time? Do I need to do something next? What's that next level of response I need to take? So it's going to be here sooner. Does that put me in a bad position? Do I need to get more things done? Or do I have more time? Or is it more parallel? Is more so it gives them that so what factor that they can see these things, puts it in context. It's an interactive tool. It's great to have these great, beautiful graphics and so many great graphics that are out there, but to take those and marry it up with those studies and that timing. And for that community, what does it mean to me to be in this community in the city or this county as these changes happen or not? And like you mentioned also, we can look at river, the flooding, some of those other hazards that would cause people to evacuate or just be cognizant of. Everything, no, but the big stuff, the big scale things that you need to keep in mind as you're moving people, which is not an easy thing, not an easy call, and it can be dangerous to when you're moving hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people in a state. And that's just self-evacuees.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking here.
Well, and there's so much, leadership courage that sometimes it might take when you start talking about folks leaving their homes, and maybe the hurricane even did not strike where their home was, yet you've told them they've got to leave, or you're evacuating hospitals. Imagine in Tampa Bay, Tampa General having to be evacuated, for example. There's a lot of leadership that goes into making these decisions as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is unfortunately, there's been times that you're going to have to evacuate and you might not get hit. There's times that because it takes so long, because we have such vulnerable communities and population, like you mentioned, a hospital, it takes time to deal with that. Better to try to move them than try to leave them there and deal with the after effects of folks that can be very fragile. So you're going to have to do that. And that's part of that assumption, that risk you have to take. And that's where the planning and preparedness comes into effect. What can I do now so that I might not have to move, or I can move people faster? What can I do now to understand how long it'll take? Who needs to move? How can I phase these evacuations so that as it gets closer, I have more confidence I'm taking those actions appropriately? It's easy if you could just say, hey, it's June 1st, everybody leave. Voluntary evacuation for the coast, time to go.
Right.
But that's not going to happen. So that's one of those things, that's the art of emergency management. How do I balance this very important decision, very costly decision against that? And yeah, there's going to be times it's going to happen. There's an emergency manager from Florida that said he had 6 hurricane threat history of his emergency manager of a county. It only hit once. And he goes, that's the nature of the game. Yeah. We have to take these actions sometimes.
What's the most challenging evacuation that you've seen?
There's been some really tricky ones out there. One that set up years ago was Hurricane Sandy. So to talk more about my role and to set up for talking a little bit about that, part of my role is when there is a hurricane out there and it might be threatening, I go support a team called the Hurricane Liaison Team, FEMA team that goes down to the Hurricane Center to help support communications, rapid communications. So the Hurricane Center can be heads down and making sure they're getting that forecast product out there, watching the models, doing the things they need to be a forecaster. And we can help support communications of whether it be teleconference calls, questions from emergency managers, issues with warnings, whatever it might be. We're kind of almost like a telephone operator, making sure people are getting the right messages. And when things are harder, making sure we can help people get what they need. And it goes both ways. Sometimes a hurricane center needs help and they need to talk to an emergency manager, or emergency manager might need help. So Hurricane Sandy was one of those that I was down at Hurricane Center, and we were dealing with it's never just Sandy in a box. We had Hurricane Irene the year before that hit that same area, but a totally different storm from a totally different direction. And dealing with that, making people forget about what happened in the previous years or some other storm and go, that was a different storm. This storm is going to be different. It's coming from a different direction. It's a bigger storm. The storm surge will not be the same. And trying to make sure people understood that. And you have very short time frame to do it sometimes. And making sure that they're understanding the nuances of a forecast as it might be developing, and making sure they're taking those appropriate actions. A lot of times people tend to, I do it, everybody does it, anchor on something. Okay, you told me yesterday we had this much time, or this is what we could expect, and now you're telling me something different, and you're saying it might be even different tomorrow. How do I get away from what I started in motion just a day or two ago and changing that? So that was one of those that we had to really quickly help change or help them understand the differences, the nuances that forecast.
You guys have really done an excellent job. If you look at successes, it's very noteworthy.
Yeah, I'd like to think there's some success in the program. It's a small program. We call it the National Hurricane Program, but it's made up of multiple agencies. FEMA, the Corps of Engineers, NOAA, National Weather Service are kind of our main players to help with the planning, help with those evacuation studies, help with that training, help provide that HERVAC program, and help operationally support that. And we like to think we're helping. Sometimes you kind of everything's quiet and everything's going as planned, and sometimes it isn't. And there's a rapidly changing forecast. So yeah, there's a lot of stories from best practices and great success stories from being down there. And every time it's usually because there's a whole team working, whether it be the hurricanes at the Hurricane Center or an operations center, or at a state EOC or in a weather service office that's being deployed somewhere. It really does take a team. It can't be one person or one agency a lot of times. It is, and all of us working together. And we really try to take a concerted effort to make sure that we're on the same page. We have meetings together. We have calls constantly together. Even if they're kind of adjacent to their work, we're involving each other and getting feedback and doing outreach. So it's a team effort to get all that done to make sure that we can support. And then it is great when you see it come into fruition. When, take for example, Hurricane Ian, when that was impacting Southwest Florida. Also, I was at the Hurricane Center, working with folks at the national level center and the regional center, making sure they understood these forecasts as they're changing, making sure the HERVAC program was working appropriately, because there's some funkiness when you start really looking at details of forecasts and timing, and then working with our Hurricane Center and National Weather Service offices, make sure their messages are going out, working with the director to make sure that their public messaging was on point with what emergency managers are talking about, and then also reaching out and listening and talking to the state emergency managers and giving them the messages through conference calls or video teleconference calls to understand these forecasts and make sure they had confidence and understanding of what these forecasts meant. And then in the heat of the moment, sometimes having calls with the local emergency managers as these forecasts are coming out there to make sure they understood what it meant, where they're making their calls to help back up those evacuations and see how that worked. In the end, that was a very difficult storm, but the evacuation orders went out as needed, appropriately. As the storm changed, as the forecast changed, they were making these calls rapidly because of those communications and making sure that the citizens were protected. At least they're doing as much as they could to make those calls. And so many other things that happened you don't even know about that might get in play, whether it be there's first responders going to communities to make sure they know there's evacuation orders, or checking in on shelters, or opening up roads and doing those things to make sure that can happen. Is it perfect every time? No, it's a disaster. But it is cool to see all those different pieces come into play and work.
Well, you talk about Ian and Hurricane Ian and that being a really good example. Other examples where you think that some of the planning and preparation have proven themselves, maybe like proof of concept?
Yeah, there's unfortunately
there's probably a whole lot, but maybe a couple, one or two more.
There's so many examples, and that's what's been crazy about my tenure so far, and some of my colleagues. We go, holy cow! We gotta have a quiet season one of these days, right? We gotta have a downtime. But what we've seen is unprecedented. Yeah, it's tough to pick out one. There's one thing, a lot of times it's when there's storms that don't hit or aren't as impactful and you're taking the right steps to do that. Hurricane Dorian having trust in Florida that that storm was going to change. A powerful, powerful Category 5 storm slowly creeping through the Bahamas with a forecast track that was going to turn to the right real quick. Making sure those were happening, and because of those relationships that we built with the state and the county emergency managers, they can have confidence in those forecasts. When the Hurricane Center and the experts on some of those hazards of storm surge and wind are talking and briefing them about those, they have confidence and know that they know what they're talking about and can say, okay, we are taking the appropriate action. Dorian was one of those. Michael was one of those examples. Another scary storm that didn't have much time. And I think that's one of those things we're learning and starting to plan for is rapidly intensifying storms. How do we deal with something that wasn't but a puff of clouds just a few days before?
Yeah, we've seen a lot more of those. My gosh.
Right. I mean, Hurricane Michael, even I think Ian was one of those where we just a few days before you make decisions, there wasn't anything there. So how do we turn that switch really quick? And that's, I think, it's a success story. Being able to utilize and have confidence in those forecasts. And I'll give it to the kudos to the Hurricane Center. Tropical weather outlooks, understanding what's on the horizon so we can plan out. The potential tropical cyclone advisories, when they start those, before a storm even has a circulation or before it's classified as a depression, they can start putting out advisories and warnings to give people that heads up. Hey, you might only have a few days, if that, before you see very hazardous conditions. Being able to do that now, when you look back, we talked about Andrew. That was one of those that you didn't have. It was a puff of clouds on Friday. I believe the story goes. The story goes is, hey, we'll talk to you on Monday. It's going to be nothing. And then on Saturday night, it went, it's changed its mind, and we need to get things done now.
Yeah, and before it hit the Bahamas, it was like, in fact, I think the National Hurricane Center was going to issue its last warning on that, or its last advisory, and then boom, overnight, it picked up steam, and the rest is history, as they say.
It's crazy to think about all those storms. That was one of those that helped formalize what we do a little bit. Hurricane Opal, if you remember that one from the Gulf.
I do, yeah. That was a crazy one.
That was another one. That was another one that said, we went to bed thinking one thing, and a few days later, totally different. Intensity, size, and forward speed all picked up.
We've mostly been discussing the planning and preparation stages, but there's also the initial response stage. Anything around the initial response stage that you'd like to talk about in regards to FEMA?
Yeah, we're really trying to make a concerted effort in supporting our counties and states and getting effective evacuation information out there. We've spent some time talking to them. Where are the shortfalls? Where do you need help on making that last mile of folks understanding they need to evacuate to take those protective actions? And is it solved? Probably not. We are, as you mentioned, growing along the coastline and in very vulnerable areas so fast. People from out of the area, from out of the country, with many different needs, and trying to get to those different communities. And FEMA's really taken it to heart to look at the entire community, not just, hey, you need to evacuate. How can we help our counties and states? We know that's where a lot of the hard work is happening. How can we help them with that? We're also looking at getting out into the communities as fast as possible post-storm, and making sure that when they are seeing people go to door, whether it be get a water bottle or understanding what's available to them, we're trying our hardest to get the disaster survivor assistance out there to get people registered and know what's available to them as they're recovering or dealing with a home or damages or trying to find support for their businesses. So we're really trying to, but thankfully the science has gotten to the point where we can have confidence. Are we going to be ready every time? Probably not, but we're going to do our best to get people and teams staged to be ready to support the state and counties as they provide those services, those critical things for life-sustaining, life-saving efforts. We are forever meeting. The joke of our agency, a forever meeting agency. A lot of meetings, but it's meetings with our state and the right people to understand what are your needs, how do we be there for you, what can you handle, when do we need to take over, and where can we stage? And that's that logistics piece. That's another part of FEMA that's pretty big, is the logistics. How do we get things where it needs to be at the right time? How do we scale up right and be ready for that without wasting, without being overbearing on a state or community and show up with too much stuff? So that's part of that science of understanding those forecasts, taking those forecasts from Hurricane Center and understanding how to right size that. Are we talking 1,000 people impacted, 10,000, 100,000, a million? Where's my priorities? Where is that timing? And that's where we're working also within a lot of our programs to make sure we're there with the right resources at the right time and not overbearing.
Are you able to use any of the GIS information, river information from the HERVAC tool to kind of retro or back in, I guess, some of the recovery efforts, knowing where people are most likely had been evacuated based on that information?
That's a great next steps in what we're doing. Luckily enough, I also manage our GIS group in region. And
Perfect.
yeah, and there are some great tools that we're getting at our disposal when it comes to flooding and water, because that does displace folks and damage stuff. So there's different ways to get at this, whether it be modeling. There's now a National Water Center. It's making a concerted effort to understand what that flooding footprint will look like when a river is at a certain level based on certain rains, and giving us a good feel for what it looks like. There's also some great data out there that the people are looking at satellite imagery and drone imagery to understand flooded areas. We can get large swaths of areas of flooded areas, and we can cross-reference that with structural data sets and community data sets of where stuff is in the way. Sometimes it floods and it's okay. People don't like living in areas that flood a lot, but we do have that. We do have those areas that cross and beautiful rivers and coastlines and places. So we try to understand that through that GIS interface, and we're getting good at it. There's some great tools out there that can take those two data sets, match them up, and say, here's the areas that are most impacted. Here's the communities that saw the most water and the amount of structures and the amount of people and things in the way. So that is that kind of response and understanding the full scope of an event. And sometimes it takes time to unfold. So that gives us that first stab at where we need to send teams, or where else do we need to look other than this coast where the media was highlighting. Looking inland, that was Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Idalia, looking further along in the coast and where that flooding was happening. So yeah, we're seeing great strides in that in the past few years of understanding the flooding footprint.
If you were king for a day, what would you want people to be aware of?
If people really could take the time, understand what they need to do, evacuate, not evacuate, what they need to do if they shelter in place, what they need to bring with them, if they need to stay in place or shelter. I think that's that next piece. And people really have to say, this is important to me and my family. Unfortunately, it's hard to do. I mean, I have trouble think about, I have trouble thinking about if I have to leave my home for 2 weeks on end in an emergency, what am I taking? Where am I going? That's a tough one to do. And with what kind of resources? And that's the other part, is what kind of resources do I need to do that? And there are some simple steps to be ready for that. Some people overthink, I need to go hundreds and hundreds of miles. I need to stay in a hotel. Just getting inland some, or to an area that's not disastrous, or to a friend's or a family member that might be out of the way. So, just if people could take some of those simple steps in these areas, understanding their vulnerability and taking it seriously. People are not good judges of their own risk.
Yeah, that's a good point. Taking it seriously. I 1,000,000% agree with that. Any final thoughts, Brandon, around the role of FEMA, around preparedness, anything that you, I guess, want to leave the audience with?
No, I think it's, like I said, I'm lucky to be doing what I get to do with some really great people. I've been doing it for years. Obviously, I'm still hanging in there. And it's really, really, really cool to see that there's so many out there that take it to heart, whether it be at the Weather Service, the Hurricane Center, or friends at the Corps of Engineers that really want to do what's right to help people be ready from hurricanes. It's a big one, and unfortunately, it's not going away. I guess we're lucky to be able to help in that. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what direction we go in the future. What are those next things that are really going to revolutionize how we communicate with folks, how we help them be ready. We're slowly making those steps towards that. I think a big jump, which probably will never happen, but we're seeing leveraging our devices, leveraging how we communicate. I think we could see some steps there. And then on the weather side, that's what's really cool. So if you ever look at some of the history of forecasting and how that's come, it gets better and better and better. So if we can get better and better resolution and timing to help support that and be consistent with it, which we are, I think it'll just help the problem that we have to deal with.
Brandon shared a lot of great information, but the key here, I think, is the planning piece. Go to ready.gov There you'll find a lot of great information to help you protect you and yours for any disaster. Be prepared. Until next time, this is Kevin from Weather Heroes. Take care.